It's abundantly clear that Romani studies is attracting a lot of attention, and I hope very much that this will develop into an annual event. And let's all work towards promoting that possibility. What I want to do, first of all, is just make a comment before I get started. We've had some wonderful presentations today, but they have dealt either with Roma in Europe or with Roma in the past. And I want to remind you that there are hundreds of thousands of Romani Americans, maybe twice as many in South America. So perhaps in future years we can be a bit more up to date and have more Romani voices involved and working together the way we've started to. What I want to do is give you an overview of what we now are beginning to understand about Romani origins and what the implications are for moves ahead and how to deal with a lot of the problems that have come up in the presentation so far. If you go to the library, there are a lot of books about gypsies. Quite a few new ones, but the ones that find their way into libraries are pretty old and tend to repeat the same old theories and stories and so on. And the prevailing story about the origin of the Romani people is that there was a king in Persia in the 5th century who had a visit from his son-in-law from India, and the son-in-law noticed that the citizens in Persia all had long faces and needed cheering up, so he told his father-in-law, his name was Bahram Gur, that he would go back to India and send him a gift of musicians to cheer up the citizens in Persia. And this, almost certainly this happened in history, because the same story with minor modifications turns up in at least 4 different independent sources. One of them, for example, says there were 12,000 musicians, another one says 10,000 musicians. And this story got into the books and gets repeated over and over again. And I'll come back to that in sequence. When the first Roma showed up in Europe, which was in the early Middle Ages, the Europeans didn't know who they were. We know from existing records that in 3 or 4 instances there were Roma who were able to tell the Europeans who they were and where they came from. But it didn't become common knowledge. The main movement of Roma into Europe occurred with the westward movement of the Ottoman Turks. And coming across from Anatolia into the Balkans, the Europeans, of course, felt under threat because the Islamic world was encroaching upon the Christian world and had already started to do that in southwestern Europe with the Moorish occupation in Spain. And it was seen as not simply a religious threat, but also an economic one, because the trade routes in Europe went eastwards, went through the Middle East, out to the Indies, and these were now blocked off. So access to the Holy Land for pilgrims, access to the trade routes for merchants, blocked off. And this then led to the search for alternative ways to get around the Muslim world to the trading centers of the East. So when the Roma came in, they were assumed to be in some way connected with the Ottoman Turks. It didn't take the Southern Europeans too long to realize they weren't Turks, they weren't even Muslims. But that didn't explain who they were, and there were different names were applied to them, even Turks. But there were two labels in particular that stuck, and these were brought in from Anatolia. That's where, as you know, where Turkey is now. And one was Egyptians, and one was the hands-off people, or the don't-touch people, which in Byzantine Greek is Atsingani. And from that word we get all sorts of derivations like Tsigan and so on. And from Egyptian we get not only gypsy, but Gitano or Gitano, and so on. Lots of languages use this Egyptian reference. And not even that particular word, because one of the words in Romanian means Pharaoh people. So there's this connection with Egypt. The Roma moved out into the rest of Europe, and when they got far enough away from the Balkans, the Europeans had no first-hand connection with Turks. They were restricted to the Balkan area, but they certainly heard about them. And so it was easier for the Northern Europeans to assume that these dark-skinned outsiders were in fact Turks or Tatars, some kind of invaders. And so we get a different approach to the arrival of the Romani population in the north. The Europeans still didn't know who the Roma were. They knew who they weren't, but they didn't know who they were. And those Roma who were able to say where they'd come from, their voices got lost in history, and the understanding of the history itself became lost amongst Roma. And that's pretty significant. When you lose the details of your own history, and you're not able to tell people who you are and where you come from, that allows outsiders to come up with all kinds of suggestions of their own, and they certainly did. And when we look at the various hypotheses that were put forward over the centuries, one, for example, that gypsies, Egyptians, came from the moon. One of the Elizabethan names was moonmen. Another hypothesis was that they had come from inside the hollow earth. Another was that they were actually Jews who had gone into hiding during the anti-Jewish pogroms in the Middle Ages and had hidden underground for so long, and when they came out they were all dirty, and that would account for the dark skin. It was also assumed by a lot of people that gypsies weren't a real people at all. They were made up of the criminal dregs of lots of different European societies. They deliberately darkened their skin with walnut juice and made up a secret jargon so they could practice criminality. All of these ideas were circulating. Another story that has become part of the conventional wisdom has to do with the breakthrough, the revelation of the actual origin of the Romani people. The story is that in 1760, a student of theology from Hungary, his name was Valley Stefan, was attending the University of Leiden in Holland. And he came from a fairly wealthy family in a town which today is called Győr in Hungary. And on the family's estate, they employed a lot of Romani laborers. And he had presumably become friendly with them and had learned quite a bit of our language. And on this particular occasion, as the story goes, he was in the students' common room at the university, and there were 3 students from India. And he went to sit with them, and he's kibitzing, listening in, and they're discussing Indian language. And he's recognizing that the words they are using are like the Romani words that he had picked up back home in Hungary. And this intrigued him, and he got the Indians to give him a list of 1,000 words in Indian, and he took it back with him next time he went home and sat down with his Romani friends and went through the list, and according to the story, they understood everyone with ease and clarity. And so his assumption then was, well, the Romani language is from India. He didn't really know what to do with this. He knew it was a significant discovery, so he passed it on to a colleague who was interested in languages. But that colleague didn't do much with it, actually, for 16 years. And finally, in 1776, the colleague passed the information on to the editor of the Vienna Gazette. And the Vienna Gazette published some short notices about this, the bottom line being Zigeuner, gypsies, are Indians. And this came at a very significant time in the development of Western scholarship. We're in the Enlightenment period. We've got the emergence of academic disciplines, for example, linguistics, and zoology and botany, because of maritime expansion and people learning about different animals and plants and so on, coming back to Europe. So I'll come back to that in a sec. I wanted to track this story down because it's a significant story. And I went to the University of Leiden some years ago. And I went through all the records. There is absolutely no record of anybody called Stefan Valley having been a student at the University of Leiden. There's a record of 3 Indian students. And in fact, that university to this day has a reciprocal arrangement with India that 3 Indians come to the Netherlands and 3 Dutch students go to India, and they complete their graduate studies in each other's country. And that's what these 3 Indians were doing. This story appeared in a couple of places in the late 1700s, but it became best known through a book by somebody called Grellman. Grellman wrote, it wasn't the first full-length book, but it's the first one people think about, Heinrich Grellman, on the gypsies. And it was quite a racist book. He apologized in the introduction for having to study gypsies. He said it was like a scientist having to study a nauseating, crawling thing in the interests of science. But he went ahead bravely and published his book. But he was writing at a time and had an assumption that followed through the 19th century, that there was some sort of genetic connection between the language you speak and your genetic history. And so the assumption was, well, if these people speak an Indian language, they must be Indians. Of course, that's a silly assumption. But it turned out to be correct, but it was still a bold assumption. And I tell my students, you know, I have students, they're all native speakers of English, but they have Chinese and African and Ukrainian and everything ancestry, but they don't speak those languages. They're the native speakers of English. Anyway, the publication of Grellman's book, which came out in 1783 in German, and quickly was followed in French and English, I think 1808 in English. But it threw out there the tantalizing fact that these Zigeuner were from India. And so the obvious questions were, if they're from India, what are they doing here? Do they have a country back there? Why did they leave? When did they leave? And so on. Coming back to Stefan Valli and Grellman's story, Grellman says the language that the Indian students were discussing was Sanskrit. Well, it may have been, but it probably wasn't. The story itself must in some way be true, because the Vienna Gazette published these findings, and it started, in a way, Romani studies to begin. But Sanskrit is quite, I mean, it's a very old form of Indian, and to compare Romani with Sanskrit would be like comparing French with Latin rather than with Spanish or Italian, because you're looking at the wrong time. Secondly, there are not 1,000 Indian roots in the Romani language. There's about 800, but there's not 1,000. And it is quite unlikely that the Roma at the Valli household would have understood clearly and without any problems 1,000 words in Sanskrit, as though they were Romani. So this is a puzzle. This is a mystery. Nevertheless, something like this happened. So once the story gets out that Zigeuner are Indians, we've got different people coming up with their own ideas about who they actually could have been. And this is where the story about the Shah of Persia, Bahramgur, and his son-in-law, Shankar, turns up. And it was an English military man called Harriet, Colonel Harriet, out in India, who'd read the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, where this story exists. And he said, well, this is obviously the answer to the identity of the Zigeuner, because the story says we've got a whole load of Indian musicians all leaving India, coming west into Persia all at once. And the story goes on that after a year, the Shah lost patience with them and sent them on their way. And there's nothing in the Book of Kings to say that they turned around and went back to India. So Harriet's assumption was, well, they just kept on coming west and ended up in Europe. And that has become fixed in the storybooks. You see it over and over again. A little bit later, another German called Wickenauer wrote a letter that appeared in a book where he said, we can nail down the actual identity of the gypsies because they call themselves Rom. And in India, there is a very low caste social population called Dom. And the Dom do all the menial jobs. They empty the septic tanks and they entertain and they work in slaughterhouses and do all the crappy jobs. And that's what the Roma do. And a lot of them are musicians. So it all fits together. And so that then became part of the conventional record. And we have books in the Romani archives that came out 2 years ago repeating these stories. 19th century, European scholars learned about two other populations that spoke Indian languages but didn't live in India. And the first one that came to their attention were people called Lom, who live in Armenia and Eastern Turkey and elsewhere in the Middle East. And then a little bit later, another population called Dom. And the Dom speak a language called Domari. And the Lom speak something called Lomavren. And then in Europe, we've got Rom that speak Romani. And so as we move towards the end of the 19th century and comparative historical linguistics is picking up, and particularly interest in Indo-European languages, because, you know, English, French, Latin, the whole thing, and Sanskrit. And here was a very lowly population speaking a language descended from this noble Sanskrit with its rich tradition. How to explain this? There were several scholars well known in Romani studies, but two names in particular stand out, and one is that of a man called John Sampson. John Sampson, he was an Irishman, but he was the librarian at the University of Liverpool, and he is really best known for finding a variety of Romani, a very pure variety of Romani, spoken in Wales. And he wrote a massive grammar and dictionary of it. It's become pretty much extinct. I was over there in Wales a month ago. There are people who know some, but it's pretty much had it as an everyday language. But Sampson was able to record the whole language in a magnificent book, and it's worth looking at if you have a linguistic interest. But he believed that the Lom, Dom, Rom populations all came from the same early migration out of India. He didn't go for the Shahnameh story, the 5th century. He said 9th century, 800s. And he said there was a movement. He didn't really explain why, but he said there's a movement of Indians out of India. They travel through Persia and then go off in 3 different directions. Some of them stay pretty much in the Middle East because the Dom today are centered in Syria and Jerusalem, in that part of the world. And then the Lom branch off into Armenia, and the Rom keep on coming up into Europe. He was challenged up to a point by a later scholar called Ralph Turner, who was an Indo-Aryanist. He's produced a wonderful dictionary of the Indo-Aryan languages, Hindi and Punjabi and so on. And he said, well, the migration probably didn't happen in quite the way Sampson said it, but he still saw three people leaving at once. But the way he saw it, they separated in India and then came west. Not a big difference, but a substantial one. So these have become the accepted stories about who Roma are and where they came from and so on. And different scholars were interested in recreating the original Romani language. What is it most like in India? Where was it spoken? Who were these people? In recent years, a number of us who grew up speaking Romani and who are educated have re-examined the history. And also, linguists in India have become involved. And that's important because they have access to sources and languages that most Western scholars don't have. Some of us started to look at Romani in a different way. First of all, the dates of leaving India. Now, if you know anything about how languages progress, and let's just take English, for example. We've got Old English, Middle English, Modern English, right? We look at French and so on. We've got Old French, Middle French, Modern French, and we can take it back to Latin. Those languages had grammatical gender. You know about masculine and feminine nouns. Well, neuter as well, 3 genders. Latin had 3, French has 2, right? German still has 3, Russian has 3. But around the year 1000, the neuter gender was lost from the Indian languages, particularly in the northwest part of India. This was the transition from Middle Indo-Aryan into New or Modern Indo-Aryan. Now, Romani only has 2 genders. If it had left 5th century, 9th century, it would have left with 3 genders. It's not just the gender thing. There are also sound changes that occurred between Middle and New, which are reflected in Romani. So we can say, if we're trying to create a window in time, the bottom end of the window is around the year 1000. So what's the top end of the window? Well, it's when Roma first show up in the West. So let's say around 1250. So we've got a couple of centuries to account for. How did these people get from here to there? When we look at the vocabulary of Romani, when I teach, UT is the only place, to my knowledge, in the country that actually teaches the language. I teach the Romani language. But the way I get into it is to use as a metaphor an onion, which is layer upon layer upon layer. And if we see the Romani language as something like an onion, the heart of it, the core of it, is Indian. But then as the migration came further and further west, it acquires layers of what we would call lexical adoptions, right? New words added on, which really reflect the root as well. If we just take the core words, which are the Indian words, as I said, there are about 800 of them, which is substantial. If we look at Anglo-Saxon roots in English, I don't think it's that many. But taking that core vocabulary and looking at what we call the semantic areas, that is to say, all the words having to do with agriculture, all the words having to do with raising kids, all the words having to do with fighting. Collect them. There is a remarkable number of words of Indian origin in Romani which are military words. That means they were there from the beginning. They weren't picked up along the way. They were there from the beginning. So many words. The word for spear and dagger and prisoner of war and defeat and so on and so on. If the book that was mentioned, my most recent one called Danger Educated Gypsy, if you are interested in this in more detail than I'm giving you now, all those words and lists and so on are all in there. You can see for yourself. So there is evidence of some sort of military activity. Now coming back to the dates we've got, it wasn't difficult to examine Indian history to see what sort of military activity was going on around the year 1000. And abundantly documented are the Ghaznavid invasions. Muhammad of Ghazni began a series of invasions, there were about 17 of them, over a quarter of a century, beginning in the year 1000, to expand his empire into that part of India. And he he won pretty much every single encounter and took loads and loads of prisoners of war. He destroyed the Hindu temples. He established Islam. He was more interested in extending his territory than spreading Islam, but the two sort of went hand in hand. Response was to assemble a militia to try and resist the incursions of the Ghaznavids. The Ghaznavids themselves employed Hindus. They were called gulams. They were like mercenaries who fought on the other side. There were lots of those too. The Indians who were the fighters were accompanied by service providers, camp followers, who actually outnumbered. If you study medieval Middle Eastern warfare, you can read up on this. It's important to take account of the camp followers because they included women. The warriors were all male, but the camp followers were male and female. They were taken or followed the Ghaznavids out to the Ghaznavid base in what would be Afghanistan now. Although the Ghaznavids were fighting the Hindus on the Eastern Front, they were also fighting another people on the Western Front, and these were the Seljuks, also an Islamic mixed people. They weren't a single ethnic group. The Seljuk Empire was extensive too and was fighting the Ghaznavid Empire, and there were Seljuk prisoners of war. There were Indian prisoners of war. The Seljuks defeated the Ghaznavids in 1038 and used the Indians as allies and moved up to conquer the kingdom of Armenia. That happened in 1071. And the Seljuks established the Sultanate of Rum, and there were lots of Indians in the Sultanate of Rum. This was on the eastern end of the gradually shrinking Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire is very important, although it actually spread into the Mediterranean. But the headquarters, the capital city, straddled Europe and Asia. It's Istanbul now, Byzantium. As the Muslims moved further and further westwards, so the Byzantine Empire shrank, and the Sultanate got absorbed into the westward movement of Islam. Now, the language, the Romani language, coming back to it, does not match up with any single Indian language. It is clearly what we would call a koine. It's a compromise of several different Indian languages. We can see a parallel in the Urdu language. Urdu probably developed later than this, but the word itself means army camp. It's a Turkish word, it's not an Indian word. It's the same word that we get horde from in English. But when we've got speakers of different kinds of Indian languages, related languages, but different anyway, they work out a compromise. It's not anybody's native language. Heavily influenced by Persian, because Persian was the language of administration for all three of these populations. The Hindus, the Ghaznavids, and the Seljuks all used Persian. And Romani has a substantial number of Persian words in it. If we look at the language, we see that there are, first of all, the sources of the Indian words are from different Indian dialect groups. To take the numbers, right, which are Indian, They come from 4 different Indian languages. So we have to accept that the Romani language started out as a compromise language spoken by a conglomeration of different Indian peoples. That's important. It remained an occupational language all the way through till we get to Anatolia, when the population is settled and begins to intermarry. Now, in India, of course, there are social restrictions on cross-caste intermarriage, but in Indian societies today, around the world, overseas from India, caste barriers weaken. And the fact we can imagine, we have to recreate a picture, but if we think of an Indian population of mixed Indian background, now far from India, they're all Indians in an alien environment. They're going to intermarry with each other and with non-Indian people around them. And gradually, Romani begins to emerge as a native language. If we look at the onion again, we've got this core, which is Indian. Then we have some Dardic words, and we've got some words from a language called Burushaski, which is spoken in a tiny little place. It's not related to any other language in the world, but there are several words from that language in Romani. So we can be fairly sure that the migration went through that place, probably along the Silk Road. No Arabic, no Turkish, except much later because of the Ottomans. So we can map the route fairly confidently. One of the stereotypes of Roma is metal workers. But if we look at the semantic area of metalworking, it's not Indian. It's mostly Greek. Even the word for iron, which is sastri, it doesn't mean iron in India. It means weapon. There's been a little shift. The Indian word for iron, it's in the Domari language, loha, but it's the Romani word for iron didn't mean iron to start with. And there were several semantic transitions like that took place. For example, Shiva, the god Shiva, carries a trident, which is a spear with 3 prongs. You bend the prongs down, and what have you got? You've got a cross. The Sanskrit word for a trident is trishula. Our word for the cross is trushul. But it meant Shiva's trident to start with. And there are a lot of these little adaptations. Christianity was probably encountered in the Armenian stage, because some of the words, the word for a godfather, a word for incense, words like this are Armenian words. So all of these provide clues. Now, that's what we understand about the origin right now. What is significant is that also on the basis both of historical record and linguistics especially, there wasn't a single move across from Asia into Europe. There was probably a steady trickle, but there were 3 major moves over a span of time. If we look at the modern day dialects of Romani in the world, they break down into 3 major, quite distinct dialect groups. The first crossover went furthest, and the descendants and the people who speak the descendant of that occupy the extremities of Europe. So we're looking at Scandinavia, Britain, down into Spain. The next population to cross over didn't go so far. and was already occupied, and occupied the central part of Europe. And the last population to cross over, these were the ones that came over with the Ottomans and didn't go far at all, because what had been going on in Europe were the Crusades, and that had depleted the manpower and the artisan workforce. And the Roma came in, especially with metalworking skills, and had plenty to do in Ottoman-occupied Balkans. And they were given lots to do, and the demands placed upon them became excessive. And so a lot of them started just move away into other parts of Europe. This affected negatively the labor force, and so by the 1300s we start to get documents showing that Roma have essentially become property. They're being given as gifts, they're being bought and sold. We have a family that was sold for 40 horseshoes, for example, because in order not to lose them, they became property, and that gradually, by the 1500s, had become written into the civil codes in Moldavia and Wallachia as slavery. They became property. And then we move into centuries of more and more legally defined slavery. And we don't get abolition of the Romani slavery until the middle of the 19th century. And that was in response to two things. One was the introduction of mechanization, which made a human workforce a liability. You don't have to feed a machine. But in Paris, and we're going back to Romania with stories of how the Western Europeans were enlightened and slavery was such a terrible thing, and doesn't Romania look backward? And Romania, being a Latin country, wanted very much, and still does in my opinion, wanted very much to be seen in the same light as the Latin countries in Western Europe, the sophisticated French and so on. So we've got these two, and it's complex how slavery eventually was abolished. There was no Romania at that time. There were the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. There had also been slavery in Transylvania, but that was more allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was much more Western looking, and abolished slavery in the late 1700s. It took a lot longer in Moldavia and Wallachia, and something awful happened. In 1829, 3 Roma slaves sought an audience with the governor at the time, Kiselev, and begged for the abolition of slavery. And they belonged to a privileged category of slaves who were the zlatari, the aurari, who were the gold washers. And they had managed to hide some gold out of the rivers and tried to bribe Kiselev. And he was a very moral Christian man, and he was all set to abolish slavery. He knew it was wrong. But he said, gosh, I was about to abolish slavery, but you tried to bribe me, and I'm not going to do it. So they came that close. And then another thing happened in the 1840s, where slavery was abolished in one area for a couple of months, and then there was a Russian-Turkish alliance, took over the government and brought slavery back in. And that must have been pretty awful. So by 1855, 1856, we've got partial abolition. By 1864, we get complete, at least legal, abolition. Of course, you can change the law overnight, but you can't change people's attitudes overnight. And those attitudes linger on. In other parts of Europe, in Western Europe, the way to deal with Roma was to ship them off to the colonies, the new colonies. And we've heard about Spain today. There was the Solución Americana, which was a program to round up and ship off Roma to Latin America. And what's interesting, my students, my Hispanic students in Texas, know quite a few Romani words in their Spanish that they don't know are Romani. But they've come into American Spanish. And they're quite fascinated to learn that they already know some Romani words. So Roma were shipped by the Portuguese, and this would make a great movie, to their colonies, not only in America, but to Africa and to India. And it would have been amazing to have gone with those Roma from Europe in the 1500s. They'd been away for 500 years from India, but still speaking an Indian language and looking Indian. What it must have been like for those people. Great movie there, or novel. So this is what we understand now. Now, the significance of this, how this relates to now, as Romani identity was crystallizing, as the language was coming into being, so that population was fragmenting and moving away from Anatolia. That means that there was never one people fully formed in one place at one time. So when I was younger and more naive, I used to talk about Romani reunification, and I was hot on that. It would not be reunification. It would be unification, but not reunification, because we were never one people in one place at one time. Nevertheless, we are one people. And this is the anomaly, and this is where European governments still don't get it. Our roots are in Asia. We've been away for 1,000 years. We're well mixed. But the language we speak is Asian. The culture we maintain is Asian. We have never existed in Asia. We are an Asian people that's only existed in the West. A square peg trying to fit into a round hole. One mistake that writers make is to think that we're all the same. We're not all the same. So one size doesn't fit all. There are some populations which maintain the language and the culture very strongly. There are other populations that hardly do at all. So there's that. There are different countries that are prepared to spend different amounts on their gypsy, quotes, problem, which we call a Gajot problem. So what's good in one place won't work for another place. And it's even more complicated, because let's take Sweden, for example, which is generally a pretty decent place for Roma to live, but there are 7 different distinct Romani populations there. Some don't talk to others. It's difficult to get consensus. There are Roma who will say, well, we're the real ones. They may not be Gaje, but they're not us. They're not real gypsies. Those ideas really have come from outside. What I would like to see as a way to get through this is education, not only for non-Roma, but for Roma too. Most Roma, we don't know our history. We have to learn about it. The fact that our roots are in India. And these days, with the internet and going into a 7-Eleven and talking to the Punjabi guy behind the counter and freaking him out with words, people are becoming better acquainted with the idea, but what makes my group, for example, different from your group, that would make me reject you and say you're not like me, these are factors from outside. What we have to do is look at what we have retained from the beginning, what we share. We may have more of it than you do. We may have a different word for it. Some people in here say marime, some people say makari. It's the same thing, different dialects, but the concept is the same. We use the same words, even if the dialects are different, but the basic stuff is all the same. And the more we understand that, the more we can cooperate and be a powerful voice and take control again of our identity and not get rid of the G word. I don't mean gajo, I mean gypsy. But get it to be used properly. It's just used for anything these days. Big fat gypsy wedding. They are not gypsies. They're Irish. They're white folks. We got to reclaim ownership of the name. Okay, thank you. Are you going to do questions?
I'd love to have a discussion. We have upwards of 9 or 10 Roma here, actually, which I think is awesome, about the G word. Because it is something that so many of us struggle with, so many of us in the self-representation, dealing with our own names for our subgroups, other people's names for their group, the English word, the Czech word, all of this. So I would love to open up. Maybe I'll just stop there. I have another question, but I think it's much more.
It's good that you said that because it is a problem. One of the problems is, well, in my earlier book, We're the Romani People, which I wrote for teachers, so it'd be good for, I talk about this, and my objection to the gypsy word is that A, it's based on Egyptian, and we're not. It's like calling Native Americans Indians, which was just a historical mistake. But secondly, it comes fully loaded. You say gypsy to someone on the street, they can tell you all this stuff that we've been looking at today. So if you say Romani, you've got a blank slate to fill up. The problem is that in our own language, we don't have one word that covers every group. Because Roma, I got a problem with Roma, to tell you the truth. First of all, it's a masculine plural noun. It's not an adjective. You cannot say she is a Roma. That would mean she is a bunch of men. What I do, what I recommend, and I've seen it used today, is use the adjective the way we do with other peoples. French. They are Romanis. Sinti people hate to be called Roma. Romani Chals, we don't, for Romani Chals, Roma would mean husbands. A married man is a Rom. You get Romered, right? You get married. So there isn't one word in our own language. So we resort to gypsy, and let's face it, that's the word we use all the time. We have a new site, and I want to draw attention to, where's Mario? Oh, there you are. Mario Williams there has created gypsy.com. Maybe, I don't know about now, sometime it'd be good if you say a few words about that.
It's not, what you close with basically is that the word's not going away. If you listen to all of the speakers who spoke today, we've heard about Roma, Romas, Romanis, Roms, and all these are amongst educated people trying to describe gypsies. If you cross this one on the street and you say, I'm a Romani Chal, I'm a gypsy, oh. This would be the same here, anywhere in the world. If you say, if you want to cut the discussion off real quick and end it, I'm a gypsy. Oh, okay. It's done. So that's the word. Mm-hmm. So what do? You go, We can't do this from without, let's do it from within. Take steps to take ownership of the identity. The identity is linked to what you call yourself. Your name is your identity. So to get this identity solidified in the world, you need to take control of that image, and we start with the name.
Yeah, we're not alone. I mean, Welsh, right? Welsh is the Anglo-Saxon word for foreigner. They were called that in their own country when the Anglo-Saxons came in. The Celts had been there before, and they're called foreigners. They don't call themselves Welsh, they call themselves Cymry. But yeah, what do you do? There's a big discussion going on one of our websites of how Native American groups are getting angry with the Redskins and the Braves and so on, and the appropriation of Navajo is the big one that's being discussed now. You know, leave it alone. That's our name. You can't call yourselves that. So it's become sort of political.
So I don't know, and but I was just thinking about your comments, Mario, because I grew up as a Gitana, as a Spanish woman in Marin County, in Hill Valley, so as the only ones that know that's true. Then you said, oh, I'm a gypsy, okay. So I haven't had that experience. I've had the experience of like, you know, I'm a gypsy. Me too, I love to travel. You know?
Oh yeah. All the time. All the time.
It was a trip growing up because it was like, I'm a gypsy, dad's a gypsy, family's a gypsies. But people were coming dressed up on Halloween and they were calling themselves gypsies and they don't look like my dad and this went on. So, you know, my dad's like, what are you talking about? I don't know anything about Romani. I don't know what that means. And I'm like, you know, I can call myself gypsy, but it's better call me Roma if you're not Italian, sorry. But that experience of I'm a gypsy and people say, oh, okay.
Well,
No.
I'm from Austin. Originally from Austin, where we teach this.
Right.
There's a little bit more awareness there. One, because of what his work, but also because we have about 300 families in the north side. And we have such a large population of English gypsies, Romani, that the population is well aware. And so some people would say that I talk with an accent. Even in that area, no, I don't hear it. But I can
In Texas,
speak to
they say
someone like in Texas.
Interesting.
But I can be in Texas, in Austin, and be on one side of town and be buying a drink at a store, and they'll say, well, do you know so-and-so? You talk just like them. There's that many of us in the Austin area.
Right.
So it's a little bit
But I think that's kind of at the core of it too, because it is very surreal to feel like you understand your own identity, but yet, especially for children, to be met with, you know, that kind of anxiety of just knowing that if you tell somebody, they don't know what it is.
Well, weren't you told not to tell anybody?
Yes.
Because we all were.
I've never done what my father told me.
We were all told not to tell anybody.
We told anybody, we were bad.
But I don't want to, not only do I not want to raise my kids that way,
Right.
I can't raise my kids that way.
Yes.
Because my kids are constantly asked, are you Indian? This is New York City. Are you Indian or are you Spanish? And they are neither. And
No,
they
I'm Puerto
lie.
Rican. I'm Puerto Rican.
Right. You know, or are you speaking Portuguese? Or they have to account for their skin color, and it's a constant question to me. Do they? I mean, I told them what my daughter's not really category. My son, I told him, you say both. You say Romani, and it's not Romania, and you say it means gypsy. But if he just says gypsy, people are not only not going to get it, they're also going to get all sorts of things that are wrong, you know. And,
At this point, you're going to see Irish people in large dresses.
What you said, Petra,
What do we tell our kids? You know, does anybody have a formula that they think works particularly well?
this use of Romanian and Romani, they're very similar, really upsets the Romanians. And we get a lot of hate. We get some really vicious hate mail about this. And we got one a couple of weeks ago, and it says, why do you keep calling yourselves Romani? You're not us, and so on. The fact is, Romania as a nationality dates from 1862. Romani is a word, goes back to Sanskrit. So we're not taking anybody's name. It's much older than the name of Romania. But still, they don't like it. And on the census forms, a lot of Romani Americans will put Romanian instead of Romani, which pushes up the Romanian quota and brings down the Romani one.
So I want to thank everyone for this conversation and remind you that tomorrow we're actually having a roundtable discussion from 12 to 2, and this is a perfect conversation that I want to continue, and that will be in the International House, which is at the top of Bancroft. It's a big white building with a dome on the top, you can't miss it. And it will also be tomorrow featuring Karina. Casual conversation together. One more question?
I have one question.
Okay.
But I think it's first.